Welcome, everyone. My name is Jill McCluskey. I'm the moderator for this session that is sponsored by the International Association of Agricultural Economists. And it was organized by Mettenheim. And this session will have some number of short presentations. And we're very pleased to have a mixture of high potential early career researchers and then some just amazing senior colleagues that we're so pleased to have on this program. And two of the early career presenters are recent award winners of the AAEA. And so we will lead it off really strong with Umalele. We're so honored to have her here. She's the president of the IAAE, and she will talk about farm size, productivity, and food security. Welcome, Uma.
Oh, that's interesting. Challenge me. You can either see me or hear me, or you can't have both. Thank you very much. So every now and then I'll peer this way and that way so you can see me. Okay. So thank you very much for giving me an opportunity to present this. This is mainly a review of literature, nothing very original. Now, can I move this down? Why is... Okay, so I was a student of Ted Schultz, and in those days, the traditional narrative was that small farms are more productive than large farms. And that's the literature mantra on which I grew up as a graduate student. But then when I was writing this book, I realized that there is huge amount of literature on farm size and productivity, which I wasn't that familiar with. So the traditional narrative was based on the fact that small farmers are basically using their own labor and they're applying it to a point where the marginal productivity of labor is quite low, often lower than the wage rate, but they still are more productive in part because they are using the food production as a way of food security for themselves and the household. So the challenge to this traditional narrative came largely from scholars working on Africa, Collier and Durkheim and Gollin, etc. They started questioning whether small farm development was the way to develop African agriculture, and especially to contribute to the transformation of the economy. And they were saying that can't increase productivity on a large scale on small farms. There is growing urban population, diseconomies of scale in marketing, high costs of marketing, etc. So we must look at other ways of increasing productivity. And this also coincided with the fact that what happens when there are factor markets which did not exist earlier. So farmers were basically using their own labor, but as capital markets, land markets, etc. develop, and there is lack of security of tenure, it just opens the floodgate for many different farm sizes to be productive. There is Will Master who wrote something about it, so I'm going to refer to him. So the literature on number of small farms is very limited, the data, I mean, and then basically, as far as I can see, two main sources of data. One is FAO's numbers, which are comprehensive and they cover all countries, and they suggest that there are 570 million farms in the world, 500 of which are family farms. There is an issue of definition of what a family farm is and a small farm is. And they keep on saying that family farm is not necessarily the small farms, but family farms are the ones where the user is primarily the owner of the farm who applies his own labor. So they insist that one should not confuse between family farms and small farms. And there are about 450 small farms, according to FAO data, and only 12% of the world area is covered by small farms. So it's 475. So it's all very confusing, quite frankly, about what the extent of small farms is. And this is very important from a policy point of view, as you will see. Now we find that if you look at the trend in farm sizes, there seems to be some consolidation of small farms leading to larger size farms. And Will Muster, I'm glad he's here, he wrote a paper where he argued that small farms were getting consolidated and they are getting a little larger. But when I look at the data on India, for instance, I find that that's not the case. In fact, small farms are getting more fragmented and smaller, etc. And it has something to do with policy issues with regard to small farms that I'll come to. But the evidence that large farms are more productive than small farms has existed for a long time. I had done a paper in the 80s, for instance, showing that large farms can be more productive in Africa. And then there is a lot of literature here that I have referred to, which suggests that larger farms are more productive than small farms. There are some studies on India, for instance. Deininger argued that small farms are essentially facing a big problem in functioning of labor markets, etc. And there are cases of Brazil and other places where people have shown that there is a U-shaped curve. Large farms are productive, then they become less productive, and they become more productive as the farm size increases. And don't ask me why, but in all countries, regardless of the farm size, this pattern seems to exist. The middle-sized farmers seem to lose out on having access to large farms. So Fugli and Rada brought all this evidence together, and they now developed a new narrative based on all these case studies to conclude that there is no single farm size which is more productive than large farms, unlike the old days on which I grew up, the literature where small farms were more productive. And basically they are showing that it's a U-shaped curve, and it goes, as I was pointing out earlier, by small farms being more productive, they become less and less productive, and as farm size increases, they become more productive. So that seems to be the current narrative on farm size, which is no farm size is sacred about productivity. And so that's the end of it. And I had to review a lot of literature to come to this conclusion, but thank you very much.
Hard time. Yeah, okay. Okay. So thank you so much, Uma. That was fantastic. We have our second speaker is the winner of the Agricultural Economics Best Article Award for 2020. And I'll welcome Jessie Lynn from Göttingen. And Jessie will speak on effects of farm size on food production and diets in rural and urban households.
How do I do this full size? Oh. Control or Alt? Thanks. Full screen. Okay, great. Thank you, Jill, for the introduction, and thank you, Martine, for inviting me to be a part of this organized symposia. I think Uma did a very good introduction to what I'm about to present today. So I will be presenting on a paper that I've been working on the past year, titled "The Effects of Farm Size on Food Production and Diets in Rural and Urban Households." To set the stage of it, we all know that the agri-food system has been transitioning in the past few decades. For example, farmers are increasingly engaging in market-oriented production, and the number of medium and large farms have been on an increase. And this has been associated with things like increased productivity and benefits to smallholder farmers. At the same time, more than 80% of the farms worldwide are less than 2 hectares. And in particular, farms in sub-Saharan Africa remain small with low productivity, low input usage, and are heavily dependent on household labor. On the demand side, growing population and demographic changes are expected to increase food demand and alter dietary patterns into the future. So as Uma has said, there has been an ongoing debate in the literature on the inverse productivity size of farms and the role of smallholder agriculture in low and middle income countries. I won't get into it because it has already been said. However, both sides of this argument often does not adequately consider the interrelationships between agricultural transformation and economic development, such as on-farm employment, incomes, urban food demand, and food security. There's much previous literature that explored the linkages between agricultural production and food security / welfare. However, most of these have been done in rural households, mainly agricultural households. And as mentioned, medium-sized farms between 5 and 100 hectares are growing in sub-Saharan Africa, and this is contributing to much rural transformation. So far, we know very little based on empirical evidence on the relationship between farm production of staples and the diets and food security of rural versus urban households. So this study builds on the previous work that I did with Ma and Sexton that was published in the AAEA last year. And in this study, we took a theoretical framework where smallholder farmers are able to transform into commercial operations and staple crop productions. And we wanted to look at in the study is how does productivity increase from commercial farming operations affect the welfare of consumers. And we take into account marketing margins, the labor inefficiency in commercial farms, and the credit constraints for smallholder farms. To sum up, what we found is that transformation to commercialized farms increased staple output, partly due to improved access to credit for large farms and the lower farm retail price spread. On the welfare side, we find that urban households' welfare almost always increase, but not for rural households, because now they don't have own production to depend on and must rely on market prices. So the overall objective of the study is to examine the implications of changing patterns of staple production due to changes in small versus large farms on rural and urban dietary diversity and food security. And the first question that we want to answer is, how do changes in small farm versus large farm staple crop production affect output prices? And second, how do these potential changes in food prices affect the dietary diversity and food security of urban and rural households? And we'll look at this in the case study in Ethiopia. The country has been undergoing much transformations, such as increasing incomes and urbanization. Small-scale farming still takes up about 90% of the agriculture sector, though this phenomenon has been rapidly changing. On the demand side, the share of cereals and expenditure is decreasing, yet it still accounts for about 70% of the calorie that is consumed. The country still suffers from high levels of food insecurity, in particular agricultural households in urban areas. And this is the conceptual framework that we use to analyze the study. First, we see how changes in smallholder production versus changes in large farm production and how that affects prices and quantities of the main staples that are being produced. And those are wheat, sorghum, barley, teff, and maize. Then we see how this affects total expenditure and food expenditure of households, and how that affects the food security and dietary diversity. And we looked at this from a timeline between 2013 and 2018. So we take data from the World Bank's LSMS economic survey, socioeconomic survey. We have waves 2 through 4. We don't use wave 1 as it only has data from rural households. And we take key variables such as crop production, farm size, staple prices, and etc. And just to get an idea, yes. So this is a population density map. So we can see that most of the population is concentrated in the west end and not so much in the Somali region. And we can also see somehow this is related to malnutrition. This is the percentage of children that's stunted. So other than Somali region, I think you can see that there is a clear trend that's is similar to urban areas. So to briefly summarize some of the findings that we found is that prices are 3.5 to 5 birrs lower per kg for larger farms than smaller farms, hinting that this could lead to lower prices for consumers that are now paying that pay market prices. And in terms of dietary diversity and food security, so when prices increase for teff, wheat, and sorghum, dietary diversity increases in urban households. When prices increase for maize and wheat, dietary diversity decreases in rural households. And for food security, when prices increase for teff, food security decrease. And when prices increase, food security increases. When prices increase for maize, food security increases for urban and rural households. So that's just a brief summary of the findings. And just to conclude, what we want to do with the study is understand the relationship between farm size production, prices, and household diets. And we extend the empirical in the understanding from rural to urban settings. We observe a difference between rural and urban households, and we can speculate that these differences arise due to the fact that rural households are agricultural producers and urban households are net food buyers. And finally, our findings intend to provide empirical evidence for future policy and program design and implementation, and in particular to consider the specific context. And with that, thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Jesse. That was great. Our next speaker, we're returning to the more senior group. We have Metin Kaim from the University of Bonn, his new university, and he will be speaking on smallholder production, diversity, and child nutrition.
Thank you, Jill. Coming. Good. Yeah, I think that fits nicely after the two other presentations. We are again also in this presentation looking at how farming and the type of farming can affect nutrition, but this is now with a focus on smallholder production and also smallholder consumption. So in small farm households, this is joint work with Makai Kokonya in Malawi and Jacob Ricker-Gilbert and Milo Muyanga. Overall, let me give you some background. It's not surprising to you to hear that child undernutrition is widespread. One of the most comprehensive and widely used indicators of child undernutrition is stunting, meaning that children are too short for their age. And that's People may be asking, yeah, what's the problem just about linear growth? Most of you may know that stunting as an indicator is associated with various types of physical and cognitive impairment and development impairment. And that's why stunting is used as a widespread and comprehensive indicator. We know that stunting is caused by insufficient nutrient intakes, a couple of other factors as well, but definitely insufficient both macronutrients and micronutrient intakes are among leading factors. And we also know that holding other things constant, that more diverse diets, so people eating more diverse types of foods tend to be less affected by stunting. So one of the key questions we need to ask is how can the diversity of diets be increased? Since we're looking at rural and agricultural households and many of these households produce.
Check it out. Look at this.
And the question is, does higher farming diversity actually lead to improved child nutrition? Or in other words, is a diverse farm pictured here, better diet and child nutrition outcome, something that's less diverse. That's a question that people have been asking for a number of years now, and there's a bunch of studies available, different countries, different methods to some extent, and that line of research has really increased the last 10 years because there are more and more data sets that include both consumption and production related data. And we have run a meta-analysis that was published in 2018. You can't see that this is not only Keim, but Sivatu and Keim here. Production diversity in all of these studies is usually mentioned by the number of species produced, little differences, but it's in the end, it's about the number of species or the number of food groups produced, and dietary diversity is usually measured in terms of the number of food groups consumed, either by households or by individuals over a certain recall period. So that can be 24 hours or it can be 7 days. And when you're looking at the results of the meta-analysis, first of all, we're seeing here that growing additional species on your farm increases dietary diversity, significantly so, but also look at the magnitude of the coefficient. So adding one species on your farm on average leads to a 0.062 increase in the number of food groups consumed, which is not exactly big, right? So in other words, it would mean you have to add 18 species to your farm in order to increase consumption by one food group. So it's a small effect. We see here a breakdown by region. In Africa, the effect is somewhat bigger, but even that is not really big. Yeah. So in the end, one needs to see that, hey, what's happening? It's not moving forward. That the effect is positive on average, but small, and we could conclude here and say, okay, so adding additional species on average may not be the greatest or most effective thing to do, but we need to see that, first of all, dietary diversity is not a bad proxy, but also not a perfect proxy of child nutrition. And most studies that have been underlying here, the original studies, use cross-section data. And therefore, yes, it's an associational analysis, but there may be issues with endogeneity of various forms. And that's where we come in with our more recent study. We use representative panel data from 4 African countries. That's LSMS ISA data with a total of over 50,000 child observations with child anthropometrics. And here you're seeing the 4 countries included and the number of survey rounds. And we are able, because it's panel data, to also use panel data econometric models. So we're looking at the effects of farm production diversity on child height for age Z-scores. So child linear growth controlling for a set of child, household, and contextual variables. And I just want to show you some of the results. Here we're seeing, if you look at the first column first, that's combining the estimates for all countries, that obviously producing more different species on the farm does contribute to positive child linear growth in a statistically significant way. But again, let's look at the magnitude. That's somewhere 0.01. Height for age Z-scores measure standard deviations, right? And it's not a big effect. It's a relatively small effect. And interestingly, when we look at the individual countries, we are seeing that in none of the individual countries is the effect actually large. And in 3 out of the 4 countries, it's not even statistically significant and partly even negative in terms of the sign. We could stop here, but we went a little bit further and said, well, it's also interesting to look what's produced and what are the additional types of species produced. And in this graph here, we're differentiating between crops and livestock. And for crop, the interesting message is the effects are even smaller and not significant in 2 of the countries, and even statistically negative effects in 2 of the other countries. That can happen. Imagine that you have a small farm, you're already growing lots of different crops, and you're then adding crops. I mean, on your 1 or 2 acre farm, obviously that can lead to foregone gains from specialization and can turn out to have negative effects on child nutrition. Interestingly, however, for livestock, the effect is a bit different. First of all, it's consistently positive, and secondly, it's larger in magnitude. And that's interesting. So obviously, I mean, we know that livestock products, animal sourced foods are good for child linear growth. But when you produce more of these, also we see more consumption in the farming households, and that seems to be conducive for child nutrition. We're looking a little bit back and forth, what are other factors influencing this relationship? And one that comes out consistently is access to markets, which is plausible, right? I mean, the better your access to markets, the lower is the need to produce on a subsistence basis. And that's what we are seeing here. The effects are larger regardless of what we are looking at for more remote households than for less remote households. And we obviously also include market access in various forms as control variables, and we see consistently that households with better access to markets, holding other things constant, have better nourished children. So coming to the conclusion, the results here with child anthropometric panel data actually confirm what was found earlier, namely that additional farm production diversity has positive, in some cases, positive effects, but not consistently. And that means increasing farm production diversity is not a generally applicable strategy and not a very effective thing to do for improving child nutrition. That doesn't mean that diversity isn't good. Diversity is needed in terms of diets. Diversity is needed in terms of the food system. But that doesn't mean that diversity, the more diversity at every scale is necessarily good. So not every single farm needs to produce everything. Markets play an important role, and the better markets function, obviously, the better that is. For livestock, is a bit different. Livestock production in the current situation seems to be good for child nutrition in many situations, but here our interpretation is this is also due to insufficient market functioning for livestock products. Imagine, I mean, milk is perishable, meat as well. And, you know, when these markets would function better, then probably also it wouldn't be necessary for all farms to produce that oneself. So markets is key, and I don't want to create the impression that diversity is not good. It is good, but it's not a general applicable strategy to imagine that, hey, add a couple of species on every farm and nutrition will be better. It's not that simple. This is research that was published recently in Lancet Planetary Health. If somebody wants to take a look, here's a link. It's open access. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker is another award winner. It's Michael Keenan, who was the 2021 T.W. Schultz Award winner, and he's from Wageningen University. His topic is researching market access for food systems transformation. Welcome.
Thank you for the introduction. And yeah, so I'm happy Martin talked about market access at the end, tees off nicely for this discussion. So let me get right into it. So my objective here is not to present, say, new research, but to discuss my mindset in viewing market access for food systems transformation, especially in the context of the digital revolution. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start out with the motivation, and then in my second point one, I'll talk about theory, how we can improve theory, measurement, and analysis of market access. So not showing up exactly how it does here, but essentially we've had different types of rural development policy over the years. So the dominant type of thinking has been the green revolution. This is that we can drive structural transformation through on-farm productivity. And we match that on the research side with really household analysis, putting the household at the center of our research. And we use field experiments, household analysis, adoption studies, behavioral, our common tool set as development economists. Well, in the last 20 years, we've seen inclusive value chain development become an increasingly popular policy tool. And what we need is new research methods to address these new policy approaches, right? So then came out a lot of firm analysis, stacked surveys, which are not only surveying households, but upstream and downstream service providers as well. And also more qualitative analysis of these firms and their constraints. And so now what we've seen in the last couple of years is food systems. So last year was the United Nations Food System Summit. And what this is doing is not only, it's almost encapsulating these green revolution and this inclusive value chain development, but also adding these consumer environments and consumer behavior and also policy and external drivers and putting it in more of an interrelated systems framework. And also looking at different aspects, not just productivity, but sustainability, resilience, health, and inclusivity. And so now, how do we research this? We see new policy typology or a new policy framework. How do we research it? We can't use the same tools as we've always used. So we see some systems mapping, economy-wide modeling. And frankly, I don't think this question has been strongly addressed of how as economists we can deal with this interrelatedness. So why have we moved towards food systems? Well, frankly, the Green Revolution in Africa failed. We didn't see the transformative effects that we did in Latin America and Asia. There's increasing policy relevance that I discussed. And then market access fits into this very nicely because all of this interrelatedness in food systems, well, you need channels for the different components to interact. And those channels are typically markets, right? And then parallel to this, what we've been seeing in the past, say, decade or so, and it's increasingly picking up, is the digital revolution. And why is this different than previous revolutions, say the Green Revolution or even the British agricultural revolution? Well, it's not focused on on-farm technologies. We're seeing a new type of technology, which is about market linkages. Think platforms, right? In high income settings, we see Uber, Booking.com. It's becoming an increasingly platform economy, and so we're starting to see that in low-income rural economies now. And this is a very fast-paced development, and there's little rigorous evidence of how these market linking technologies work. And I'm skeptical of whether our methods are equipped to handle this. And so thinking about that, we actually need to think through all of these different aspects of market access, starting with theory. And we need to start with the fundamentals of, okay, what exactly do we mean by market access? Often we think about it as the absence of transaction costs, right? So maybe an easier question to ask is, well, okay, what are transaction costs? And these can be variable, fixed, or fixed transaction costs of buying and selling on a market. But they can also be participation limits, which is often what we see in liquidity markets, where I'm a financer and I'm not going to give a smallholder more than $100 in credit no matter what. We've also seen a failure in our theory to deal with the interrelatedness of markets. Smallholder households participate in many different markets, and their barriers to entry in each of those markets is going to affect their participation in the other markets. We've also seen we ignore the fact that markets are two-sided quite often. We look at it from the farmer's perspective, but a market takes buyers and sellers, right? So often we're not looking at who's on the other side of the market and what those constraints are. And often we treat transaction costs as exogenous, something external to the farmer. It's not something that's being decided within the system. And in reality, and as we see these digital platforms rise, we're going to increasingly see that these transaction costs are actually a decision that's being made by another economic actor. And so what we can do is we can start to think about this theory through a systems approach. And so if we take the farmer here and we look at input markets, output markets, consumption markets, labor markets, and finance markets, and how they interact with all of these, we can start to think how a new way of thinking about rural development can come about. And this dotted line here is just to indicate that this output and consumption market it's almost the same market, right? I sell food and I buy food. Okay, well, what if we start taking in the two-sidedness of these markets? And what if we start taking into account the transaction costs with these X's denoting transaction costs, right? This becomes a little bit more complicated. These households can they can behave and also sending labor off the farm, but then we can start seeing these constraints a bit more clearly, and then we can start to understand, okay, maybe how does this barrier to entry of financial institutions to access the finance market, maybe how does that affect farmers' behavior in output markets, right? And all of this is interrelated, so treating these transaction costs as exogenous can be quite difficult. So then we want to start moving on to empirical analysis, right? Well, the first thing we need to think about is measurement. Well, market access is complicated. There's many different components, right? And we know this is well established in many different papers in the literature. There's risk, there's contract enforcement, there's ability to meet standards, there's last mile delivery costs, physical infrastructure, market power, information, right? And all of these components are at play in all of the different markets, right? And they're all value chain specific, right? A farmer's market access in a maize market is not going to be the same as their market access in the bean market, even though we're talking about the same farmer, right? Well, all of this is very obvious, but every time we talk about market access in the literature, maybe not every time, we use physical infrastructure. How far is the household from the market? How far is the household from the road? So my point here is we need to start thinking about measurement. We need to start taking this seriously and start coming up with indicators for market access that take into account a more holistic view. And this could take into account stacked surveys. We can't do it simply from household surveys because we have to recognize that there's barriers on other sides of the market. And then we can start using some of these modern techniques as well. We're about sensing data, machine learning, et cetera. We have more capacity to do this than we did.
Recording in progress.
Well, then the last point here is about empirical analysis. Well, what kind of methods should we use to analyze this market access, right? If we have a system approach and everything is interrelated, well, as economists, we like exogenous things, right? We like to randomize. Well, how do we deal with this interrelatedness, right? And I bring up this point here about interventions versus approaches here as well, because now with a lot of these digital technologies that are addressing multiple different aspects of the farmer's constraints at once, it's not a singular mechanism that we're addressing. We need to figure out how to analyze these approaches. And I bring this up here. So like in a very broad digital platform, it's going to be able to address all of these different barriers to entry at once, right? And so then we need to start thinking about, okay, what are the methods that we need to use? We like to randomize as economists, but what exactly are we identifying? What do we randomize? Which of these mechanisms are we actually addressing? And also when we randomize and we get these causal points, right? Well, the basis for that from a policy perspective is, okay, now I can roll out my program and I know exactly what the effects will be, but actually, can we replicate this? When we do these approaches, it's very context specific. So, and so my last point here is, so all of this market development is also non-random, right? So if we introduce randomization, what exactly are we addressing, right? If that's not how it's being rolled out in the real world, such that infrastructure is non-random, organic market growth is non-random, farmers are non-randomly targeted by service providers, we need to start thinking about how we can understand that growth and how we can understand how these systems operate rather than maybe tinkering and trying for exact causal identification. So that's what I have to say on market access. Thank you so much for your time. And yeah.
I really enjoyed that. It was made me think about what all the issues that can be addressed. So thank you. Our next speaker is Thomas Kopp from the University of Siegen in Germany, and he will be speaking on market power in different types of smallholder contract schemes.
Yeah, thank you for a very nice introduction. Also, thank you for to the organizers, or for the organizer for putting together that nice session. Okay, so I'm presenting a work with Alwin de Sousa and Ashok Mishra from Mexico State and Arizona State. And we are relating actually two issues that have been mentioned before: institutional settings and market functioning, market power. The title of the paper is Buyers, Market Power and Contracts in Agriculture, Evidence from a High Value Crop in India. So let me start briefly with the key messages of that paper that I would like you to walk away from this talk with. So first is that, and that is not the newest insight, is that contract farming is often associated with market power. And that's the thing that we bring in here, is that there are different types of contractors, and contracts might differ in regards to the market power that is associated with them. And the theoretical considerations, they suggest stronger market power for production contractors, which enables them to depress output prices. However, this price depression might actually be outweighed by lower production costs on the farmer side. And we find some empirical supports for these thoughts for the case example of okra in Karnataka in India. So let's briefly start with the market power and contract farming. Yeah, sure. I'm stopping my timer here, okay? Great. I think you want to hit that one, and then you see the whole panel.
Thank you.
No, actually, we're here. So
Okay.
I think it's good.
I just call where
No, the PowerPoint. Here. Yes. Perfect.
Okay.
Yeah.
Back to you. Thank you.
No worries. All right. So market power is well established in the literature, and we're differentiating here between different types of contracts in regards to the market power. And to be more specific, we look at production contractors and marketing contractors. The former dictate the agricultural practices, they guarantee to purchase all of the output, and they offer extension services. While the latter, they mainly guarantee a fixed amount to be purchased at a certain price. And what they both have in common is that there are some minimum quality requirements. Now let's look at what kind of results we expect at the farmer's level. So from the production contracts, we expect that there are some potential benefits because of more efficient production, because of these extension services leading to better agricultural practices and leading to higher quality output. However, there's also these potential detriments because of the market power that is, as I'm going to argue now, systematically related to the production contracts. And that has something to do with the fact that a production contracting firm has some fixed investments per contract farmer, such as these extension services and monitoring, supervision, etc. So they will have a preference for signing exclusive contracts. While for market contractors, on the other hand, they only buy a certain share of the farmer's yield, and the remaining yield is to other marketing contractors or in spot markets. So because of these two different mechanisms, we would expect a systematically higher concentration amongst production contracting firms than amongst marketing contractors, and correspondingly higher levels of market power because of that, higher levels of concentration. And now the question that we're trying to answer in the empirical analysis is which effect dominates. And in general, I have to say that it's a little bit difficult to generate empirical evidence on that, because the production contractors and marketing contractors may interact when they're active in the same market environment, let's say in the same village, because the system, if there's market power, then these systematically lower prices offered by production contractors might be driven up by the higher prices of the marketing contractors. And now our okra cultivation in Karnataka and India provides an interesting example, because in these settings, there are no villages where we have both production and marketing contractors operating in parallel, but there are also independent farmers who sell to the spot market who exist in all villages. And that's going to be important in the next step in the identification strategy. Okra is a very important crop for the region. India is actually the biggest producer of okra in the world, and Karnataka is among the top producing states there. So now the empirical strategy. Remember, we want to estimate the effect of the different contract types on farm profitability and on market power. So the first challenge that I mentioned before is that we often have these two different types of contractual settings active in the same village. And in order to circumvent that, we purposefully selected a study site where we have like these two institutional setups clearly separate from each other. However, that now leads to a second challenge, because we need to control for some unobserved heterogeneity between the different villages. And typically one would do that with some fixed effects. However, given that here our solution to the first problem, we cannot do that because these village fixed effects would be perfectly collinear with our variable of interest, the participation in the specific contracting scheme. So what we do is that we benefit from the fact that we have these independent smallholders being active in all of these villages. So we calculate the relative advantage of the contract farmer under consideration over the average of all of the independent smallholders in the same village. So this here is like a very brief shortcut of our estimation. So here on the left-hand side, this gamma, this is this advantage of the contract farmer I in village J over the average, like over all of the average of all non-contract farmers in the same village. And here pi, these are different measures of farm product profitability in order to disentangle the aggregate effect. So we have the profit per hectare, profit per kilogram, yields, and prices. And our key explanatory variable here is this dummy for participation in a production contract. And then we have a bunch of controls, which I'm not showing here. The data was collected in 2017-18 with 660 okra farmers in that area. And now, don't worry, I'm not going to discuss everything on one of that coefficients. The only thing that is important for now is that first line, where we see that we have a statistically significant positive effect on both our profit measures, but a negative effect on prices and like no significant effect on the yields of the participation in production contracts. So what does, so that's just what I just said. So what does that, or what does that probably tell us? So the results suggest that we have these price, or we measure these price depressions, and that, following the whole story from before, could suggest that we have monopsonistic market power, and that depresses the prices for farmers below the prices that farmers receive from marketing contractors. However, despite this price depression, production contracts are still more profitable for the farmers. So, and that can be explained with lower production costs for the farmers in production contracts, right? Because of the more efficient input use, because of these extension services, and that results in less inputs that are used per output. That has actually been found in the literature before, and that also explains why there's no yield effect. So I'm clicking through that because that's the summary that I just said everything. It's only 9 minutes. And instead I want to, since this is work in progress, I want to just briefly chart out the next steps. So first is that we want to actually test this implicit assumptions, like there's quite some assumptions in this work. So one implicit assumption is that these independent smallholders that we have in all these villages are systematically similar. And that, I'm not expecting like any surprises there, but just to say it. Then second, we want to estimate the effect of the production contracting on the production costs. That goes or is done in a similar way than these previous equations that I've just shown you, and that helps us to confirm this potential explanation of lower costs in production contracting. And now the third one, and that's the critical thing here, is about the identification strategy. Probably you've noted that in the previous slides, that actually what we're showing there is like not directly market power. We only show that we have lower prices in production contracts compared to marketing contracts. And that could actually be like, that doesn't need to be only market power. That can also be just to compensate the contractors for their costs, such as the inputs, what do you have, like the inputs that they provide, or that they provide at a cheaper price for their farmers, and for the extension services that they provide. And yeah, that's like our next step, to control for that in the estimation, to really be able to disentangle these effects, what is market power and what is actually just like a fair share of the contracting firm's costs. And if that works out, then we can go to a step further and calculate welfare effects and counterfactual scenarios by simply estimating farm cost functions and then backing out supply elasticities to see, yeah, what the supply responses are. And yeah, thanks for showing me the sign. So we're actually done here. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Now I'd like to ask all the speakers to come up to the front, and we'll have some time for discussion. I guess we're short. So I just want,
Next session, 11.
oh,
and I'm supposed to speak there.
oh, at 11.
If I go.
Okay, yes, please. Yes, okay. Well, thank,
Have any questions?
thank you, Uma. Okay. Well, I just want to invite people to, everyone to ask questions and have some discussion. Yes.
So thank you all. You all very fascinating. I could probably ask everyone a question, but I wanted to start where we left off with comment. This is an interesting approach. I'm wondering though, given the background you gave about a marketing contract decision versus a production contract decision, if the cost of joining one of those, say for either or is higher, right? Your leftover control group might be systematically different. So I'm wondering if potentially a matching scenario where you match the MC and the PCs as well as do a matching for the control groups to sort of follow out this middle to try and maybe think about if that could give a better basis of comparison, potentially, or at least do a robustness check, because you might have some selectivity if the transaction cost to participate is different, at least behind a characteristic of control.
Actually, thank you for that. I mean, that actually, I don't put it on the slide, but when I say that we want to compare the independent smallholders among these two villages, we will also like just check if these participating smallholders are systematically the same or different. I wouldn't expect that they would be very different because like the way how what we're told about it from the ground is that actually the contracting firms who select the farmers, because like from the farmer's perspective, all these contracts are profitable. So it's the contractor's decision on which farms which farmers can include there. But of course, nevertheless, you might be right that they might have different criteria. So that would be something to check out. Yes, thank you.
So, Thomas, fascinating research, and I'm sure you've already read this literature. But Michigan State, I can't remember, I don't think it was Chris Barrett, but I can't remember right now, about 15, 20 years ago, they did a extensive analysis of the effect of Walmart entering Mexico and all of Central America. Because just like what you're describing in India, they select the farmers, they provide the extension, they provide the input. Long story short, what they find, yes, the press prices, lower cost, and more importantly for farmers, in a sense, lower volatility of their income, which allow them to plan their production processes a lot better and overall increase household welfare because of that stability. That makes sense. If you haven't looked at that literature, I would highly recommend you do. Michael, we had a fascinating discussion last night on the digital transformation. Right now, I think what's going on in Africa is creative chaos. Everybody's jumping in it. A lot of them will fail. The transactions cost that, and we discussed it, that I think needs a lot more attention is the telecoms and the back-end support for these movements. Because there's not a lot of thought is being given to that. Who's gonna, process the data? The cost of transmitting that data. Farmers need a smartphone. When the app is no longer working, where's tech support? So in your bucket of transactions costs, I think that's a big one.
You want to comment either?
Yeah, thank you very much for it. I think that's an interesting thought. Actually, I think with lower volatility in output prices and better or longer planning horizons from the farmers is one of the reasons why the farms become more efficient, right?
So that is somehow like captured by our story, but it's an interesting component. And we also have that in our empirical analysis because one of our measures or our controls is the time of like for how long the farmer has been in the contract. And that could probably capture partly of what you're saying, that that they've had this stable planning horizon for a longer time. It's interesting. Thank you for the information.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree with you. Yeah, because what we hear is when these platforms come in and their goal is to reduce these transaction costs, they're also adding different transaction costs. And some of this, yeah, I mentioned in the back end, but also mediation as well. And not all farmers in Africa, those farmers in Africa don't have smartphones. If they do, they're not using them through these applications. So a lot of times you see basically agents coming in that mediate the interaction between the platform, which has its own set of transaction costs. Who is the mediator? How well do they work? Also, are we putting a lot of risk if it's one person mediating the interaction? What happens if they quit? Then these farmers lose their access all over again. So yeah.
I have a question, if I may.
Yes.
A question to Michael also, and I fully agree with the question you raised, and with the need to become better in terms of measuring market access, seeing that markets can be quite different, that markets always have at least size. But I would like to challenge you a little bit on providing perhaps some answers to those important questions. And how do you think we should, in an African context, or could measure market access? We're briefly mentioning something around more integrated surveys. I can fully understand what you mean with that. And of course, this is difficult, but since I'm personally very interested in that type of research, I'd be happy to hear a few more thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think the first thing that we need to do better as economists is to take advantage of qualitative analysis. So when we do go into these contexts, really doing the groundwork in terms of qualitative analysis to understand what are the existing market structures, who are the key players, what are their constraints from a very high level, right? And then we can start to think about the exact indicators that we want, right? So I think we could start with these dimensions listed above, right? And then start pulling through different surveys to say, okay, how can we measure how can we measure the constraints through technology? So I think that would be the first thing from my perspective, starting with the qualitative analysis, really getting an understanding of what's going on in these markets. And then the second thing is SAC surveys, not only going to the households, but also going to the input providers and the upstream and the downstream, so the off-takers as well, and start trying to get at their constraints to reaching the product, what are their costs in the last mile delivery, for example. So I think if we start with just start from there, I think we can make a lot of improvements. Yeah, I know that's not very complete. The thing is, I don't know the answer to that. This is on the research.
I have a follow-up. There's a paper in Tanzania by Afterwall, I don't know if you're familiar with it, from 2018, I think that that's exactly what you're talking about. Yeah. I have a question for Martin, kind of in the spirit of organized symposiums and thinking about the future. If you could just share your thoughts on the future of this question of farm production being separable from consumption, and the sort of any distinction between the different food groups in terms of whether it matters if the farmer themselves, if their own village, if their own district is producing, in terms of market access. So any thoughts on kind of going food group by food group in terms of the relationship between local production and consumption. I'm thinking especially like things like dairy and the scope of the geographic scale of aggregation of different sectors. Do you have any thoughts on kind of the future of this farming work?
I mean, there's a big push towards diversification, and I think many people need different things with diversification, and I think where we still need a lot more research is at what level we need diversification, and obviously that has a lot to do with where we are. It's not the same everywhere. When in the US farm or usually farm context where we have a limited narrow number of species, I could imagine that increasing that number of species at that level is useful from a sustainability perspective because it may have positive biodiversity. I don't think that the same holds true in the smallholder context where African farmers are very diverse anyway. But I think bringing it to a higher level, now we're talking about diversification of countries that we import from. I mean, the war in Ukraine has shown that dependence on one or two countries is dangerous. So everybody's saying you need to diversify the resources, right? And for some countries it may mean producing more themselves, but some countries may not be able to do that. So it means diversifying the resources. But what are the costs of diversification? And what are the benefits? Not only in terms of pure economic or pure nutrition, but bringing in also the other dimensions. I think that's a big research agenda and really understanding the role of markets that can connect different levels. And when you're asking, I mean, what's the right, is it the community or is it, we don't know. I'm sure it will differ by food group, and I'm sure it will differ by context. But I see exactly those types of questions as big research questions that we as agriculture and food economists need to look into. And diversification comes at a cost. Yeah? I mean, if Egypt decides to become very diverse in terms of where it's importing from, that's coming at an additional cost, and that's something we
these are all very interesting points. I think to follow, thinking about qualitative research, or call it, Ag-Econ departments used to be tied up with rural sociology. So I think we have a history of really exactly what you're talking about, working very closely with those folks. And, specific, I don't know if I call them rural sociologists, but I think of someone like Jim Scott and his work, Weapons of the Week, and sort of thinking about why peasant farmers maintain certain property and certain systems to be resilient against state power. And so kind of broadening this into that context, I think there is this inherent diversity amongst populations that might see benefits in, crop diversity and so forth in the cropping system that perhaps aren't as apparent without sort of consulting the qualitative side, because, I think there are real questions there.
Yeah, so maybe I'm approaching this from more of the development economics perspective, and what we've seen in the last 20 years or so basically the revolution especially for not only empirical research, but one thing political research, right? And so this is come at lots of depth, right? So this is where my comment is that, we need to improve the quality of research, because A lot of it is including an office 3,000 miles away, and then this is the intervention. We measure the causal effects, and then right, and this is coming a lot of yield insight to you that into what exactly is going on and what exactly policy effects. But yeah.
So from the team, with respect to the effects we're seeing from the livestock diversification, I'm curious what specific animals we're seeing there and why there might be such a stronger effect than with the crop diversification.
Yeah, we have a breakdown actually in the paper, looking also separately into milk and meat and eggs, particular, and it's not uniform across countries. I think there are few of the countries, eggs and milk and dairy have stronger effects than meat production. Which makes sense because it creates regular supply and also that regular supply, which obviously is sold to some extent, but some of it is also consumed. And if we do have some confidence that today we can also show that also producing milk and eggs and we're also consuming more of that. I think one of the important differences between crop and livestock is also the question of seasonality. When you're producing crops, and especially vegetables and fruits, there's seasonality involved, and that means the persistent pathway only works for a certain part of the year, and you also cannot store fruits and vegetables for a long period. So that's something that one needs to have in mind, and that's obviously much less or non-existent at all for most of the livestock products that we're harvesting all year long, and therefore get that seasonality. Actually, William Masters and colleagues shows also that the price variation, local prices, is much lower for livestock products than it is for crop products, and therefore the question of affordability is one that needs to not only look at average prices but look at some of the seasonality, and I think that plays a role here. Why
Yeah, following up on that, I was wondering if it might be an issue of increasing marginal benefit of increasing the number of different of the diversity, because people have, I would guess, in general, people have less different types of livestock than of crop types to start with. So when you have already 10 crops and you add one, that might not add to the dietary diversity, but actually reduce what you said, the farm efficiency more. And when you have 2 livestock types and add one more, it doesn't increase so much or reduce so much your farm efficiency, but really improves the nutrition.
Yeah, that is true. I mean, most households have, if any livestock, have 1 or 2 species, and a big fact is that adding livestock at all, right? So there's no question about that. And whether we do dairy and egg food, and then obviously it's adding. But this is something where you can easily include square terms, and usually the square term does show a negative sign for both livestock and crop. But it's not so large that negative sign that it will take away the message that, hey, livestock seems to matter more in that diversification. But obviously,
the fact that there is a negative square term is already interesting and obviously makes that extrapolation of social species a kind of question.
Also wondering what the measurement, right? You mentioned the proximity factors when we're working with here, right? So if you know the production diversity of seasons, so you might only know the consumption diversity for what happens in, right? Or how does that play a role in
That's true. I mean, in surveys that are run at a certain period of the year, and then it's asking for either last 24 hours or last 7 days. That's only a certain part of the year. There are very few surveys that look into seasonality by higher frequency surveys. That's an interesting area. However, having said that, we were working with psychometric data here. That's obviously different. I mean, hyper-HF scores and something that's a longer-term measure, and it's taking care of that problem.
when you think of some of that, thought about it when properties about this typical small area. But you can also see that the context is moving towards more fertilization in the market. Whether you also see differences that it could also be we pointed out as that this change in pattern going on with production. We know that very well that also shift in some of the parts. Anyone is looking into that, without looking through all the presentations, that's the one thought that just kept coming to me. And then if I try to look at this, some of the demand for spiritual lifestyle, you see that urban setting and that creating sort of momentum, changing production process as well in a spatial market.
I mean, in my eyes, the demand that's first of all there and then effectively reflected in what farmers, the price of farmers are getting, obviously is and should be one of the key drivers of farmers' decisions of what to do, right? So, and we do see that if markets for certain perishable commodities improve, that more farmers market incentive driven are starting to produce these things for the market. That type of diversification in my eyes is great. But it's diversification, and that's what quite a few development interventions are doing is with a subsistence view. And you should eat more vegetables, so if you produce more vegetables in your garden. I mean, for a small NGO that has no option to work on improving markets, that may be a good idea to promote that. But for policymakers that obviously have a portfolio of what they can do, I would always say, I get the markets work better and actually contribute then also to more system diversity that we need. I mean, the markets don't work well, then the things that will work are the most perishable. But they happen often to be more efficient ones, and that means when we talk about markets, we shouldn't only mean the things, right? I mean, there's a lot of things that that was a more probably question. Yeah. Someone
Any more questions? Well, I guess then we can just think of one.
Still hanging out.
So I work on very similar issues. So actually one of the first papers, sorry, my name is Aditya. I was at Cornell and when I was a master's student there, I worked on this paper, Russian diversity and diversity. It was one of the first papers actually, where we worked on Malawi and LSMA. I was just picked up, I was published in food policy, picked up a lot of, I think it came at like published it in 2014. That was the time when there was a lot of research going on.